Once again, we'll turn to Matthew chapter 6. We'll be looking at verses 22 and 23, but let's begin reading with verse 19. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, this is the importance of where we place value, whether earth or heaven. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? Again, Jesus has spoken upon the duty, the necessity of having proper value and affection for spiritual. Now I believe here in verses 22 and 23, he illustrates this truth. He illustrates what he said there in verse 21, which is the conclusion of verses 19 and 20. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So what he says here in verses 22 and 23 illustrates verse 21. Many will say Jesus has jumped to another subject here, but he hasn't. Jesus very orderly. He's just illustrating again what he's just said. So he uses the illustration of the eye in verse 22. He says, the light of the body is the eye. The word light is the same word used in verse 15 of chapter 5. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light. It's the same word there. Unto all that are in the house. And there it's used with reference to a lamp or a candle in a house, providing direction for movement in that house. So it has reference to that which brings clarity, has reference to that which dispels darkness, that which reveals, provides guidance and safety. That's how he used it in chapter 5, verse 15. Here in verse 22 and 23, the eye is said to direct, just like light, to direct and control the actions of the body. In other words, it controls physical activity. Now, from what Jesus says here in verses 22 and 23, it becomes quite obvious that the eye, the way he's using the word eye, is referring to something more than physical sight. In the light of the context, again, remember verse 21, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So in the context, the word I would correspond to the word heart of verse 21. And throughout the Word of God, the heart is used to speak of the mind, the understanding, the affections, the emotions, and the will. Sometimes it speaks of all of those collectively. Other times, just one or two. But the eye, like the heart, I believe here has reference to the mind of man. It's what controls the body. It's what controls physical activity. The mind is considered by many to be the most complex living mechanism in the world. And again, it is the most influential part of the body. And like the eye in the illustration here, the mind directs, the mind controls the actions of the body. From the involuntary beating of the heart to the conscious decisions of life. There's the mind, the brain. The brain is connected neurologically to every organ of the body. It's the motor of the body. This is also true spiritually. Again, it corresponds to the heart. The mind includes the understanding. That's insight. It would include judgment, which is the ability to discern. It would include the will, the ability to decide, the ability to choose. It would include the reasoning, which is the ability to draw conclusions. And it would include the conscience, which is the ability to feel. It would include the memory, which is the ability to recall. So the mind, equivalent to the heart here, is the insight, the discernment, the choices, conclusions, and memory that determines one's perception and view of self, one's perception and view of others, one's perception and view of circumstances and of life itself, and God. And if one is going to live the life that is presented in the Sermon on the Mount, the mind has to be right. And that's what he's illustrating here in verses 22 and 23. So we see the application of the illustration. The illustration is the light of the body is the eye. Then he says, therefore. That introduces the application. The application of the illustration. So what follows, therefore, has its basis in the fact that the light of the body is the eye, or that the mind is an influential force in one's life. Again, he's already stressed the importance of where we place value, whether it be spiritual or earthly. Now he's placing importance on the mind being spiritual. One is not going to lay up treasures in heaven if their mind is carnal. If their mind is carnal, they're going to lay up treasures on earth. Where our treasures is, that's where our heart is, that's where our mind is. That's how we think. So we see the importance of a spiritual mind. And he stresses that. He says, if therefore thine eye be single, that is, sound in vision, the result of that is thy whole body is full of life. So we have this single eye. The spiritual mind is described as a single eye. Again, the eye has already been described as the light, as the lamp of the body. That is the guide, the controller of the physical body. The word single speaks of this lamp giving clarity, just as it was used in Matthew 5, verse 15, as opposed to a dim light or a flickering light. The word single is descriptive of the eye, and it has reference to clearness of perception, singleness of focus and purpose. And that's brought out in verse 24, which we'll get to at another time. No man can serve two masters. The eye has to be single. The mind needs to be single. That's a spiritual mind. Has one image, one object, and it does not blend these images, does not try to blend these images. To possess singleness of eye is to be spiritually minded. Notice in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Very familiar verse. Verse 6. For to be carnally minded is death. But, contrast, to be spiritually minded is life, which is the opposite of death, and peace. What is it to be spiritually minded? To be spiritually minded is to have the mind of Christ. Not in perfection, of course, but is to have the characteristics of the mind of Christ. Notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Verse 16. For who hath known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. Now that's the opposite of carnally minded. We have the mind of Christ. Philippians chapter 2. Philippians 2, verse 5. Again, one is not going to live this Sermon on the Mount life carnally minded. It's not going to happen. They have to be spiritually minded. They have to have the mind of Christ. That's what it is to be spiritually minded. Philippians 2 verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. We are to have the mind of Christ. And such is the result of having the mind enlightened and guided by the Spirit of God. So we are exhorted to be like-minded with Christ. Notice 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 4. In verse 1. For as much then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. With the same mind. This is what it means to be spiritually minded. So we are exhorted to be like-minded with Christ. How do we do that? How do we become spiritually minded? Well, a spiritual mind, of course, minds spiritual things. That's what it dwells on. It dwells upon spiritual things. And dwelling upon spiritual things, it'll lay up treasures in heaven. A carnal mind dwells on carnal things, and therefore they lay up treasures on earth. So, in order to be spiritually minded, we have to mind spiritual things. There has to be an interest in spiritual things, spiritual matters. Notice in Deuteronomy, and this is what God commands. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thy heart. Thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house. So they're to be taught, they're to be talked of when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way. No, it doesn't matter where you are. And when thou liest down, and when thou risest up, and thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, that is, they're always there, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. They were to dwell on it. They were to dwell on the teachings, the commandments of God. To be spiritually minded is to dwell on spiritual things. Our minds, of course, go in all kinds of directions. And many times that can't be helped. Many times it can. But it's where do we dwell? Upon what do we dwell? A spiritually minded person dwells upon spiritual matters. Which brings us to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, verses 8 and verse 9. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. Think on these things. Those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, do. And the peace and the God of peace shall be with you. So, the spiritually minded exercise their mind in spiritual thoughts. They meditate upon spiritual things. That's what it means to be spiritually minded. Notice in Psalm 77. Psalm 77. Verses 10 through 12. This is a psalm of Asaph. And I said, this is my infirmity, but I will remember. I will remember. That's part of the mind. The years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember. He's resolved to do this. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember. That's 3 times. I will remember. I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate also. That is in addition to remembering. I will meditate of all thy work and talk of thy doings. That's a spiritual mind. Remembers spiritual things. There are people who cannot, and I say cannot, let go of the past. They need to, but they can't. And the reason they can't is because their mind's not right. It's because they're carnal minded and they're not spiritually minded. A spiritually minded person can move beyond the past and remember spiritual things rather than carnal things. But a carnal mind can't do that. So, spirituality and the mind are vitally connected. They really can't be separated. The mind, like the eye in the illustration, is an influential force in life. And what the mind feeds upon, a spiritual mind feeds upon spiritual. Carnal mind feeds upon carnal. What the mind feeds upon, that becomes a very influential force in our life. You can ruin your day just by thinking on the wrong thing. You can ruin your week. You can ruin your life. So, what an individual feeds upon determines how they think, determines how they perceive things, how they live, how they feel, and on it goes. So how do we have a spiritual mind? We have to mind spiritual things. How do we accomplish that? Well, we have to continually, because of the world in which we live, because of our human nature, because of the human nature of others, we have to continually watch against the intrusions of vain thoughts and imaginations. We have to always be aware. We have to strive to keep it out. Notice in Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. Again, all of this is crucial to having a right value system. Where we place value depends greatly upon how we think. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17. This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind. In the vanity of their mind. Now notice, there is a connection between the mind and behavior, between mind and walk. They can't be separated. How you think is how you live. So here Paul describes the walk and the mindset of an unsaved individual, and he's warning the child of God against this mindset. The warning implies that necessary precautions must be taken, that we do not walk in the vanity, that we do not have a vain mind, an empty mind that leads to emptiness. How do you do that? Well, he tells us in Ephesians 4, in verses 22 through 32. He mentions several things that need to be done. He says in verse 22 that you put off. If you're going to have a spiritual mind, you've got to put off some things. You put off concerning the former conversation, the old man, speaking of our nature. Verse 23, the reason you need to put it off is because it's corrupt, according to the deceitful lusts or desires. Verse 23, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Well, how are you renewed in the spirit of your mind? You have to put off. You can't allow these things in. And if they're in, you got to put them off. You got to get rid of them. They'll get in. You can't walk down the street without them getting in. But you got to put them off. And you can't delay. You got to be put off. It's poison. The poison has entered your body. That's how you need to look at it. And be renewed in the spirit of your mind. And that you put on. This is how you're renewed. You put off and you put on. It's not enough to just put off. It's not enough to just put out carnal thoughts. You have to put on spiritual thoughts. One has to replace the other. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So, put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. Verse 25, wherefore, putting away. Again, things have to be put away. He goes on in verse 26. He says, sin not. Well, that goes without saying. If you're going to be spiritually minded, you don't sin. And when you do sin, you need to get that taken care of. He says, let not the sun go down upon your wrath, as you don't go to bed thinking about these carnal things. Neither give place to the devil. How do you give place to the devil? When you let the sun go down on your carnal thoughts. You've given place to Satan. You know, the old saying is, idle mind is the devil's playground. There's some truth to that. But no doubt the devil likes to play in the minds of God's people. Then he talks about a change in behavior in verse 28, 29. Verse 30, grieve not the Holy Spirit of God. Then in verse 31, we see again, there's things that have to be put away. Bitterness. You can't dwell on these things. You can't dwell in carnal. You can't dwell on people doing you wrong, because this will breed bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking. You need to put them away. But they did such and such. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. What the issue is how do you deal with it? How does it affect your mind? That's the issue. That's what we have to be concerned about. So, even the child of God, from Ephesians 4 verse 17, can slip into the same mindset and life of the unsaved. And if we go back to being carnally minded, our mind's not right. We've lost our mind. And it's going to show up in our life. The word vanity there in Ephesians 4:17 suggests emptiness and futility, without purpose. It's life with no meaning. The thought of the phrase vanity of mind is not that the minds are empty, but they're filled with that which leads to emptiness in life. So there is a connection again between our mind and how we live. There must be, not only we have to continually watch against the intrusions of vain thoughts and imaginations. As soon as they come into our mind, we need to put them away. We need to put them away. There must be an avoidance of that which would draw and seduce the mind into a fleshly bent. You have to avoid those things. You don't go to places, you don't do things that's going to bend your mind in the wrong direction. Don't do that if we're going to be spiritually minded. So there's the avoidance of continually minding earthly things. Notice in Philippians chapter 3, verses 18 and verse 19. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame. You see, there's nothing right about them. They glory in that which is shameful. Who mind earthly things. Who mind earthly things. We have to avoid that if we're going to be spiritually minded. The mind must be brought into subjection unto Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. Well, let's read verse 4. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, they're not fleshly, but they're mighty. Where do they get their might? Through God. 2, here's the function. To the pulling down of strongholds. And where are these strongholds? Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. This takes spiritual weapons mighty through God. This cannot be done carnally. So again, we see there is a connection here between our mind and our life. In Romans, we'll get it right. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Romans 12, verse 2. Be not conformed to the world. How do we accomplish that? But be ye transformed. Okay? If I'm not going to be conformed to the world, I have to be transformed. How do I do that? By the renewing of your mind. Be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. That, here's what the renewal of the mind does, that you may prove that you may manifest what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So now we see that a spiritual mind and being in the will of God go hand in hand. Goes hand in hand with understanding the will of God. A carnal-minded person is not going to discover the will of God. It's not going to happen. It takes a spiritual mind. It takes a renewed mind. Someone will say, well, I've been thinking about this a long time. Well, that's good if you think right. But if you don't think right, that's not good. And a lot of people don't think right. Well, you're saying that if they don't think like you, they're not thinking. No, if they don't think spiritually, they're not thinking right. Plain and simple. Well, I've given this a lot of thought. And you've been thinking about it all that time wrongly. So what good is it? That's a very dangerous thing. And I've had many people tell, well, I've thought about this a long time. Well, first of all, you should have prayed about it rather than think about it. But knowing the way you think, that's dangerous. So, again, the two go hand in hand. So the mind must be brought in subjection to Christ. So we have the significance of our frame of mind. We'll approach that negatively, and then next week from the positive side. The Bible speaks of a doubtful mind. In Luke chapter 12, the Bible has much to say about the mind. And Luke chapter 12, verse 29, seek not ye what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, neither be of doubtful mind. A doubtful mind causes us to seek the wrong things. If we're seeking the wrong things, the problem's not the seeking. The problem is the mind that has led to the wrong seeking. That's what needs to be fixed. It's a doubtful mind. We've already seen in Romans 8, verses 6 and 7, the Bible speaks of a carnal mind. The carnal mind is enmity against God. That is, there's a connection between the mind and an attitude toward God. But to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Again, there's a connection between the mind and our attitude toward God. A child of God has a wrong attitude toward the Lord. Their mind's not right. Their mind's not right. In order to fix the attitude, the mind has to be fixed. There has to be a renewal of the mind. You can't just say, well, you need to change your attitude. Well, that may be so. But how do they do that? There has to be a renewal of mind. The Bible speaks of a fleshly mind, which is the same as a carnal mind. Notice in Colossians chapter 2. Again, Christ is illustrating here in Matthew the eye, the mind, how it controls the body, the importance of it. In Colossians 2, verse 18, that no man beguile you of your reward in a voluntary humility and worshiping of angels, intruding into those things which he hath not seen, here's what we want to see, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind. Vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind. So now we see there is a connection between how we view ourselves and our mind. If one is puffed up He or she is filled with pride. They're the center of the universe. Their problem is they're fleshly minded, and it causes them to perceive themselves erroneously, incorrectly. The mind, so important. Titus chapter 1. Titus chapter 1. Verse 15. Unto the pure all things are pure, but in them that are defiled and unbelieving is nothing pure. But even their mind and conscience is defiled. So there's a connection between the mind and perception, how we see things. There's a connection between the mind and perception. The Bible, lastly, James chapter 1, verse 8, speaks of a double mind, which is the opposite of what Christ is presenting in Matthew 6 when he talks about the single eye, the single mind. James 1, verse 8. A double-minded man, which is the same as Matthew 6:24, has more than one master. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Unstable speaks of a condition. So there is a connection between spiritual condition and the mind. If we're going to have a right value system, if we're going to have things in proper order, heavenly, earthly, never earthly then heavenly, heavenly then earthly. If things are going to be in proper order, if we're going to keep them in proper order, that's the problem. We have to keep them there. Our mind has to be kept right. And that is an everyday battle. That is an everyday struggle to keep the mind right. When your mind goes to carnality, it could be something someone's done, whatever. Your mind goes to carnal things. And the first thing you want to do is to call somebody, text somebody, let them know how you feel, get them all carnally minded, and then the two of you talk together. How dangerous is that? Now you've got two people out of their minds talking to one another. They're not going to fix anything. But that's what happens. We have to keep our mind spiritual. When we know our mind, and we know when it happens, we know when our mind is going in the wrong direction, we need to stop. We need to get it right. And the place to get it right is with the Lord. That's where to get it right. Not by calling some other carnally minded person. That's not going to get it right. Oh yeah, you have every right to feel that way. I'd feel that way too. I'd do this if I was you. Yeah, carnal reasoning. And it just leads to more and more problems. God help us to have a spiritual mind. And we'll look at next week at more of what that involves. Brother Ben, if you'll come and